This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. Hi. What do you guys want to talk about? Thanks, guys. Back to you.
It's the calm before the storm here. The big moving day is approximately 48 hours from this very moment. The countdown begins. Am I ready? Yes and no. I'm not packed, so that's a slight problem. Although I'm only moving small stuff in at the moment. So we'll see how much crap I can actually fit in my car. Finally got an Equinox. The Jetta had finally kicked the bed. Or kicked the bucket, I guess is the cliche. By the way, I'm moving. For any of you that didn't hear my announcement the other week. Finally getting out of this hellhole in Pittsburgh. Took me a while to finally muster up the energy to do so. But I woke up one day and said, I need to bounce. And now it's a matter of schlepping stuff to and from over the next couple weeks. Shouldn't be terrible, but logistics are a nightmare. Everybody knows that. But we are here to detox from the real world. So let's do so by going over some of this classic pro wrestling footage. Make sure y'all subscribe, comment, rate the show if you have not already. You can find us on YouTube and Rumble every Monday and Friday for new content. Always going to plug Rumble where I can. And, as per usual, I kind of just come on here and hit the record button without really having much to think in the opening monologue, so we'll go ahead and roll into it here. Crockett TV. And this is one of those shows where there's primarily one thing to talk about, given that it was only an hour show this week. They advertised the big dog collar showdown between Ron Simmons and Kevin Sullivan. They hyped up the open contract stipulation last week. Simmons came down to answer Sullivan's challenge. And they made it official for this program. A special challenge match on the Superstation. By the end, it turned into more of an extended angle than anything. But we'll get to all that. And then there was the rest of the show that was just kind of there to fill the remaining airtime. I will note, there were two things that jumped out during the intros here with David Crockett, Tony Schiavone, and Jim Ross. Other than David Crockett gently rubbing JR on his shoulder while he was trying to run down a couple things, does anyone else notice that's always a thing David does? That he, casually would put his hand on either Tony or JR's shoulder when he was talking? Was that some kind of nervous tick? It's not like he would pat them and then, take his hand off of them. He would leave his hand on their shoulder for a good 15 to 20 seconds. In a very creepy-like fashion. The hell was he doing? There have been times where I thought either Tony or JR were going to ball tap him. Or backhand him across the face. God, David was so weird. Getting back to my point, though. The first big thing they announced was the World Tag Title change between the Midnights and the Horsemen. Tony sold it as a massive upset. which was essentially coded language for it was an abrupt title switch because Tully and Arn left the promotion for the WWF. So we had to get the belts off of them somehow. And thus the Horsemen Midnight's feud that they've been building up for pretty much the entirety of the end of the summer through the fall season, it has now come to an unexpected halt. And now Bobby and Stan hold both the U.S. and the World Tag titles at the moment. In addition to that big news, JR also took a minute here to quote a recent paragraph from Brian Bosworth's book. And, I really had no idea what he was talking about here. Basically, Brian Bosworth was pissed off that Sting stole his haircut and that he was looking to sue for gimmick infringement. So JR basically told him, well, Sting had that hairstyle long before Bosworth ever did. So he can fuck right off. For the record, I don't know a goddamn thing about Brian Bosworth or the Seattle Seahawks. I just love how JR actually utilized a full minute of airtime to let the world know, don't listen to this football player try to rip on one of our boys. He's full of shit. That's the good old JR I came to know and love. Protecting the business and the boys. As he should. So we open with the Fantastics versus Mike Jackson and Eddie Sweat. The epitome of one of these boys is not like the others cliche. I did notice here that Bobby Fulton was growing out some facial scruff. He looked about 50 years older. Beyond that, I wrote pretty much nothing down aside from the wrestling was fun when Jackson was doing spots with the Fantastics. And then Sweat tagged in and looked like a bump on a log. Fantastics went over with the rocket launcher, which took us to the interview booth for a Ric Flair promo. He spent about 2 minutes putting himself over as the greatest world champion of all time. Said that Luger is not the future of the sport, no matter how they try to spin it with the propaganda. Well, he wasn't wrong. And in fact, I know he's a heel. There was not one untruthful thing that Ric Flair said in any of this promo. And it was also probably the most one-dimensional Ric Flair promo through the entirety of 1988. He literally had nothing to say. Then we had the Russian Assassins versus Keith Steinborn and Gary Royal. It was funny here because, you know, the announcers are basically taking the time to differentiate the ring styles of both the Assassins 1 and 2. Meanwhile, I'm thinking the entire time, how in the fuck would they be able to differentiate them? And then I looked a little bit closer. Russian Assassin 1 was in much better ring shape than number 2. Number 2 looked like a giant walking bag of wet pudding. Buggy whip arms. No Tanner physique. And at least number 1 looked like an athlete. Probably because David Shelton actually worked out. He was the Assassin number 1, by the way, in case I didn't clarify that. So they're doing every generic 60s and 70s mass storyline with the Assassins at the moment. Paul Jones is feeding them a gimmick to hide under their masks so they can headbutt their opponents to knock them out. And that's what happened here when the Assassin number 1 distracted Teddy so Paul could pass off the gimmick to number 2. And then he drilled Steinborn with a headbutt to pin him. And that led to this awesome moment during their post-match interview. Paul Jones is standing right in between both guys. So he goes, Assassin number 1 has something to say to Ivan Koloff on behalf of the Russian people. There's a brief pause. David Crockett is holding the mic out in front of the Assassin's mouth. Assassin number 1 turns to look at Paul Jones. Time passes. And then he goes, "Oh." At which point he begins ranting in Russian. Glorious. And then Paul Jones mentioned something about Brian Bosworth. I have no idea what he was talking about. I was too busy laughing at the Russian assassin having a brain fart and forgetting that he was supposed to actually talk. Like, he's done nothing but stand next to Paul with his arms crossed for like the last 3 months. The moment he's actually given time to speak on this program, he forgets that he's actually supposed to speak. Amazing. And then Brad Armstrong wrestled a boring squash with Agent Steel. He went over with the Russian leg sweep. My only note during the match was that the announcers mentioned the sad passing of Leroy McGurk, which I think happened within the previous week. Obviously a major name in the wrestling industry, especially the affiliation with the NWA. God, I've forgotten it was that long ago, too. I mean, you're talking about a guy who was a peak talent dating all the way back to the 50s. You know, and of course, following the auto accident that wound up ending his in-ring career, that basically forced him to transition into the booking promoter role. Still crazy to think it's been well over 30 years, though. And it's unfortunate, too, because, you know, people talk about legendary promoters throughout history. I find that Leroy's name gets left off that list a lot of the time. Probably because so many people don't even know who he is, or they know such little about him, which is really sad. Vince McMahon, Bill Watts, Jerry Jarrett, Eddie Graham, Vern Gagne. Like, those names are all at the forefront of all-time wrestling promoters. And Leroy McGurk, he never gets an honorable mention, sadly enough. So, coming back, we had Nikita Koloff at the booth for a promo. He basically talked about Paul Jones and told him that he can find all the big bad athletes he wants, but Nikita will continue to hunt him down, as well as the Russians. The only thing I took away from this was the fact that Nikita looks more and more like an aging dad every single time I see him. The oversized, hideous dress shirt tucked into the jeans. Generic crew cut. God, he is so plain looking. And then we had Dr. Death against Kurt Thompson. This match had one of the greatest spots I've ever seen. So Kurt Thompson's coming off the ropes, and I'm not even going to say he ran into Dr. Death's arms. He walked over. He then leapt into Dr. Death's arms like a monkey trying to grapevine a branch. Steve catches Kurt in his arms, and then without missing a beat, he just drops Kurt straight down on his back. It was hilarious because of the fact that I had no idea what the fuck they were even trying to do. But I just love how Dr. Death's instincts were, well, I'm holding the guy in a bear hug position. I know. I'll just drop him straight down. Then he went over with the Oklahoma Stampede like a minute later. It was also during this match where everybody in the world realized Kurt Thompson, definitely on the gas. Dr. Death was a powerful big dude, but you could tell that guy was all natural. Kurt Thompson had that body where you could see muscle growing in places where I don't even think people are supposed to grow muscles. It was grotesque. God, meanwhile, they got Ron Simmons out there every week preaching to the kids about staying away from enhancing substances. Someone ought to talk to Kurt Thompson. Fucking jackass. So that took us to this wacky Road Warriors promo. I'm not shitting you. This is the entire premise of the interview. David Crockett opens by informing the Road Warriors that the Midnights essentially deemed them number one contenders for the World Tag Belts. To which Animal and Hawk respond by screaming that nobody tells them what they're next in line for. They decide when they're number one contenders. So by that logic, Animal and Hawk now declare themselves number one contenders. Well, good. Glad we settled that dispute. Aside from that, Hawk let us know that he's a little loose in the head. Word. He said that he and Animal are looking down on everybody else in the tag division because nobody's on their level. True. And then Precious Paul mentioned something about being the truth. Indeed. It was a Legion of Doom promo. No doubt about that. And then we had Ivan Koloff taking on Jerry Price. He's now the lone wolf Ivan Koloff. The announcers once again mentioning that after the betrayal of Paul Jones, there's nobody left to watch Ivan's back. All by his lonesome. So he proceeded to beat up Price with no problem and pretty much decimated him. Still basically working as a heel. But now he's got that chip on his shoulder as a result of being blacklisted from the Paul Jones army. He ended up going over with a second rope sickle. And then he followed it up with a warning message to Paul Jones and the army. This is actually a hell of a promo, all things considered. Even if the delivery didn't come off entirely how I think Ivan wanted to. We'll chalk it up to broken English. But he told Paul that he holds himself accountable for all the devious things he's done over the last few years. He holds himself responsible for aligning with Paul Jones and bringing in all these wild, crazy lunatics to fight the battles for the army. Ivan was told to bring in the baddest and the most dangerous men he could find. Which he did. And through it all, Ivan never changed his attitude. He never changed his ring style. And he refuses to start now. He may not be proud of the way he's done everything in the last few years, but he doesn't regret it either. And while Paul Jones thinks the Assassins are the biggest and baddest men he can find to take down Ivan, they are strong and powerful, yes. But they don't have the grit that Ivan does. They don't have the intestinal authority that Ivan does. And that'll be their downfall. Well, sounds like a babyface promo to me. I like how David Crockett immediately responds by going, "What a great man." A great man, you say, David? Huh. Well, I don't know if I'd entirely agree with that sentiment, but it is definitely the most likable thing Ivan's done on TV in the last 3 years. David really has faith that Ivan's seen the light, that he's turned over a new leaf. Well, we'll see about that. You can't trust a Russian. From there, we come back for a squash featuring the new World Tag Team Champions. It is the Midnight Express going up against J.C. Wilde and Bruce Hollis, which had to be a rib on the Midnights here. After just having won both major sets of the tag belts in the NWA, they then have to come out on the studio show and wrestle the bottom of the barrel job guys. Of course, that also lent itself to Bobby and Stan having fun, just toying around with them. Jim Cornette spent most of his commentary talking about the probable challengers for the tag belts, sort of downplaying them as non-credible challengers. including the Road Warriors. Probably not a wise move. Many shady comments from JC here, most of which I didn't have enough time to write down. He's always very witty and thinking on his feet. I just can't keep up with him when I'm typing because he talks faster than the human brain can function. Midnight's went over with a double flapjack. And while everybody's at the booth displaying their sets of gold on the podium, Stan Lane jumps in and talks about the demise of the Horsemen, specifically Tully and Arn, saying a couple months ago they were out here on the show proclaiming their greatness and spouting off the amazing luxury lifestyle. Now they find themselves going from limousine riding to subcompacts at dollar rent-a-car. They've also gone from top-of-the-line champagne to low-quality beer. Marriott's to Days Inn. Oh, come on now. That one was a low blow. Don't be dissing the Days Inn. It's a quality 2-star hotel. And then Corny rounded it out by saying they've got the gold to prove they're the best in the sport. And now nobody can deny it, including David Crockett. So, again, not exactly the end result we all wanted with Tully and Arn versus the Midnights. A very rapid-fire closure to a feud that was really only starting to get off the ground in the last month. And now it is on to the next piece of business. And that took us to Mike Rotunda and Rick Steiner versus Mike Justice and Terry Jones. It was easily the quickest varsity club squash of all time. They ring the bell. Rick Steiner tags in, still wearing the varsity jacket. He does like 2 or 3 power moves to one of the job guys. Sullivan berates Steiner on the floor for not tagging in Rotunda. And then the best part, as Rotunda hits his butterfly suplex and goes for the pin, Steiner then dogpiles on top of Rotunda's back to hold him down. Oh, probably also just to make sure he got credit for the finish, too. By the way, they never explained why he wrestled with his jacket on. It was kind of funny, though. And again, you hear the crowd booing whenever Steiner does what Sullivan tells him to do. Anytime Steiner is told to deliberately stop kicking ass and let Rotunda finish the job, those people boo and hiss. So they are really craving that Rick Steiner face turn as the weeks go by. 'Tis only a matter of time by this point before the dog-faced gremlin snaps. As we talked about before, though, the show is all centered around one thing. The previous 40 minutes may have well has been window dressing before we got to the dog collar showdown here. Ron Simmons and Kevin Sullivan. And I was kind of hoping for a little more than what we got, but I guess I should have seen the swerve coming. I mean, they weren't actually going to give us a full-length dog collar match between Simmons and Sullivan on the studio program. It is a family show, after all. You can't get too gruesome. So instead, we basically had a 3 or 4 minute angle where Gary Hart and Kevin Sullivan jumpstart Ron Simmons before the bell. Sullivan's whipping Simmons with a chain while he's basically defenseless. And so they go through the whole rigmarole where Simmons tries to cut off Sullivan and go after him with the chain. And right at the point Simmons gets backdropped out to the floor, Gary Hart starts helping Sullivan choke him out with the chain over the top rope. And that's when Teddy calls for the bell and throws the segment out. And that was Al Perez's cue to hit the ring and momentarily help Sullivan out. Ultimately ending with Dusty Rhodes chasing everybody off. Kind of fiery Spitfire babyface promo, telling Sullivan that he's had enough. And if he thinks he's so big and tough, he can come out and try to wrap that dog collar chain around Big Dust's neck. See what happens then. I mean, that was essentially it. Kind of disappointing if you were expecting an actual match, but they got their point across. Never trust the games master to actually follow through with an open contract challenge. The green rookie Ron Simmons, he was chastened. Had to learn the hard way. They did announce so after break, Jim Crockett that is, we are going to get an actual dog collar match, but the next time we see it, it's going to be padlocked, so no shenanigans can take place. Because something seemed pretty fishy about that dog collar that Sullivan used this week. So the boss has taken initiative. And from there, well, we basically followed a stabbing and a shooting with a low-key tussle on the playground. We go from that angle to Barry Windham versus Randy Mulkey. Now, I will admit, when I saw Randy Mulkey was back on TV this week, I marked out. I miss the Mulkey Brothers squashes on the studio shows. It has been far too long since we've seen the Mulkeys on the studio shows bumping and overselling for all the stars. And of course, Randy Mulkey was back here. Didn't miss a beat. I mean, he's out there bumping and feeding for Barry with the most outrageous bumps you've ever seen. It's like I was watching 1986 all over again. Falling out to the concrete, splatting on the floor like a pancake. The dude was fucking nuts. I was highly entertained watching Barry throw this guy around like a sack of potatoes. It was also amazing looking at the vast height difference between both guys here. Randy looked like a child in the ring. I never realized the Mulkeys were that small. Good Lord. Brutal onslaught. Barry eventually went over with the lariat. I wish it could have gone for like another 10 minutes. I also wish Bill Mulkey would have been out there too so Barry could kill him as well. Unfortunately, that couldn't happen. And that was followed with a very bizarre J.J. Dillon promo where, I mean, he basically blew off the World Tag title change in Philly like it was nothing. David's asking him about the title loss, the fact that Tully and Arn dropped the World Tag straps to the Midnights. It's pretty topical, especially when you consider the background and everything they've done to build up to this moment. JJ goes, well, you know, the show must go on. At which point he immediately turned the conversation over to talking about Flair and Wyndham. The fact that they're defending their belts in Portland this coming Tuesday. Absolutely no mention of Tully or Arn, or the possibility of them getting a rematch. Obviously that wasn't going to happen since they left the promotion by now, but I don't know. Then he talked about how Cornette embarrassed him in Philadelphia when his boys walked out as the new World Tag Champions. But the next time JJ shows his face in Philly, he'll make sure he gets the last laugh. And it'll be at Corny's expense. Okay. I mean, on the one hand, like, I get the idea they don't want to linger on Tully and Arn since they have already started heading up north to work for the WWF. I mean, I guess from their vantage point, they're trying to undercut the feud as much as possible to avoid any problems. But it was just so weird how passive JJ was. It's also one of those awkward periods we're about to enter where, for the first time since like early 87, we now have a defunct Four Horsemen faction. But now it's even worse because 50% of the group is now gone. Like, it's not one of those limbo periods where they're trying to replace an Ole Anderson with a Lex Luger, for example. This is We just lost two of our major Horsemen teammates, and now our top group is completely gone from the picture. And that problem did not correct itself until well into 89. And many argue the problem never corrected itself. Because boy howdy, they tried with a lot of different Horsemen members over the years, and just wasn't the same. And this is the first time in 3 years going where we're going to be reviewing Crockett shows where the four Horsemen do not exist. God, that is insane to think about. So then we round out the show with Sting getting a quick win over Max MacGyver. That was already rushed to hell to begin with since they only had like a minute of airtime left. But then we had the greatest close to the show ever. This had me howling with laughter. Okay, so Sting's already blown up. So he's already trying to collect his thoughts and come up with something to talk about. But he could tell he's flustered. He mentioned the John Ayers situation from his recent match with Barry Windham, where Ayers basically cost Sting the U.S. title via DQ. Really didn't have enough time to elaborate, though, because they were already giving him the Iggy to go home. So right as Sting tries to mention Brian Bosworth's comments about Sting ripping off the guy's haircut, David goes, "Sting, we're out of time. We need to wrap up." So Sting just goes, "Well, we'll just leave it at this. Oh!" That was it. That was how they ended the show. And you could see David just start breaking out laughing as they pitched to the closing credits. Awesome. Just epic ending. Sting's got it figured out, man. When in doubt, just howl into the microphone and be all crazy. Never fails. So yeah, that was Crockett. Really not a whole lot going on this week, aside from that one little angle they built up there with Ron Simmons and Kevin Sullivan, but again, it was more of an angle than anything else. This is going to be a weird period now. Tully and Arn are gone. The Horsemen do not exist. And right now, we're just buying time until Starrcade in December. Like 2.5 months or whatever that is. It's crazy to think. But there's really not going to be a whole lot going on between now and then. The Midnights are going to set up some big stuff. But other than that, Ric Flair and Lex Luger is the top program, and God, that feud is colder than a witch's tit at the moment. I don't know what to say. The dark ages are upon us. Buckle up, friends. Buckle up. So we are a week removed from the Loser Leaves Town match between Ted DiBiase and Hacksaw Duggan. Almost kind of felt like we were hitting the reset button this week. Starting fresh with a couple new storylines. Now, of course, DiBiase was such a key player in Midsouth for the entirety of last year, as well as most of '83. It is kind of the equivalent to a WWF losing a Rock or a Taker or any of the top stars during the Attitude Era. So he'll be out of the picture for a while. And with that loss came a crop of new faces coming to the Mid-South area this week. Not the least of which was a name we've been circulating for a while here. Our first look at Nikolai Volkov in Mid-South. And of course, he's sporting all the USSR apparel. So he's instantly over as a heel. And this all predated his awesome ring entrance where he forced the company to play the Soviet national anthem before all of his matches. Such a great fucking heat magnet. I mean, it was just a get-over match for Nikolai here. He took on Johnny Rich. Even though Boyd Pierce tried to insinuate that Johnny was a top star throughout the country, he was certainly a relative of a big star throughout the country. Now, Wildfire Tommy was most definitely a big name. Johnny, that's pushing it a little bit. So Nikolai overpowered him and pretty much dominated the whole thing. His finish is outstanding, even looking back to this day. I mean, it's basically a modified backbreaker where he drives the guy over his knee once, and then he basically deadlifts the guy overhead into a press slam position and then drops him over his knee again. And like, bear in mind, too, yeah, Nikolai was well over 300 pounds. At the same time, he's not wrestling 150-pound Spike Dudleys every week. Like, Johnny Rich was easily 220, maybe 230. So he's not a small dude by any means. Nikolai just lifted the guy up like he was a cruiserweight. Highly impressive. And again, we're still in the early stages with Nikolai here. So eventually we'll see him paired with Darso, and they'll have a run in the company as top heels. And that's where shit really gets good. By that same token, another big name returning to the Mid-South area. Now, we've actually seen the one-man gang on Mid-South previously. It was very short-lived, because he was pretty much in and out of the territory within a month. Before we talk about the squash here on TV, a little bit of pre-match setup here with JR and Boyd. So back on September 9th, there was a scheduled match between Dusty Rhodes and Larry Zbyszko in Houston. But for reasons, Larry decided to no-show the event. So as a replacement opponent, King Kong Bundy stepped up to challenge Big Dust. And figuring Bundy's a heel, he was going to look for any excuse to blindside Dusty. So he made sure to have the one-man gang on standby. And as we go to Houston to see the footage in real time, Paul Bosch is doing commentary. So probably best to take a shot of espresso to keep yourself awake through it. Luckily, the footage was only about 2 minutes. We see the gang hit the ring and start helping Bundy work over Dusty. And while they're putting the boots to him, we get Magnum TA and Hacksaw Duggan running out to send the big men packing. They did have double juice here with Dusty and Bundy, so I'm guessing the match was fairly lengthy. Kind of odd to see an impromptu match end with double juice. But that led back to the Irish McNeil Boys Club here. One-man gang took on Ron Ellis. Another quick little squash win for gang. He also had Skandar Akbar out there with him. It's, God, it is still weird seeing early film of the gang here in 1983 when he had the long, ratty hair. Like, all that world-class footage we're watching of him in 85 looks like a totally different person. I mean, he looks like such a superstar with the short hair and the wacky ring attire, the short beard, the shades. Like, you compare the world-class version of him to this 83 version where he just looks like a homeless bum. And that's not a knock on gang. I mean, he's a heel, so the look suited him for the time. But you see him a couple years later after the complete look overhaul. I mean, you really wonder why they didn't try that with him in Mid-South in 83. In any case, oh, by the way, gang won that match. Went over with a power slam. And that took us to edited highlights of another big angle from last week. In addition to the Duggan DiBiase bout, there was also a Bundy versus JYD match that opened the program. And the controversy there was everything that happened during the interference from Buzz Sawyer and the Missing Link. Turns out the Missing Link was in the back pocket of Bundy the whole time. Kind of how the same held true when the one-man gang helped him out in Houston. Hey, Bundy's got great ties. He knows exactly who to call for what occasion. Now, the reason that interference is so significant, because the dog was given a body splash from the missing link, which rendered a fairly significant back injury and storyline. And the idea was to prevent Dog from being able to come out later on in the program to assist her in the Duggan DiBiase match, because the heels were pre-planning well in advance. They wanted to eliminate as much babyface competition as they possibly could. So we set up the tag bout for this week. Hacksaw Duggan and Magnum TA against King Kong Bundy and the Missing Link, all of whom were involved in the angle last week with Bundy and JYD. Overall, it's a pretty fun little tag match. Kind of clunky at times, especially when the Missing Link was involved. I did kind of laugh early on. They do a miscue spot where Bundy was trying to hold Magnum in the ropes so Link could clothesline him over the top rope. When he went to charge Magnum, he actually managed to elevate himself over the ropes, and at the same time, he also collided with Bundy. So there's this really awkward moment where Bundy's like holding up Link with his massive body, and you can see Link trying to roll himself back into the ring, but he kind of got caught. I mean, it definitely looked like a monkey trying to fuck a football there for a couple moments. But they spent a while beating on Magnum. JR talked about how disappointing it was that Bundy had to resort to choking as an act of cheating, saying he's better than that, especially given his size. You gotta love it when the commentators have to call out the heels for being heels. But Duggan gets the hot tag. They do a bunch of wacky, cartoony heel spots where Duggan runs Bundy and Missing Link into each other. And the deal at the end, Hacksaw gives Bundy a horrible-looking backdrop so he can set him up for the spear afterwards. And when Magnum goes to make the visual cover, Link comes off the top rope with a diving headbutt for the automatic disqualification. So we get a post-match brawl where Duggan fights off both the heels. Meanwhile, poor Magnum's selling the effects of the headbutt of doom. I mean, it really goes to show just how exposed the business has become in 2024. The idea that a guy would be selling like he's seriously injured from a headbutt. God, these days, guys are getting run over by bread trucks in the parking lot on AEW, and they're still kicking out at one. With guys that are half Magnum size, I should add. It's unbelievable how bad wrestling is now. But back on the subject of the loser leaves town stipulation, because the next chapter in the story of the top heel is trying to eliminate Dog from Midsouth, just to prevent him from getting involved in that match. And JR laid out the gauntlet here as we go to the clip in the closing minutes of that epic match. After all the crap Duggan gets put through, having to essentially wrestle a 3-on-1 handicap match, not just with Ted, but with the hired guns, the Road Warriors. Well, we finally get JYD making the valiant return with a 2x4 to run off everybody. After he'd been taken out earlier in the show, after us all being led to believe he'd been carted off to a hospital and evaluated for a seriously injured back. Not on the Dog's watch. Because by God, he's not about to let Ted DiBiase get away with his crafty plan. So he helps Duggan fend off everybody. The 2x4 shots heard around the nation. They're just swinging this board around, hoping to God somebody doesn't get an eye poked out. And again, though, the story is so beautiful when you consider that, or coming full circle in the story of Junkyard Dog's long storied beef with Hacksaw Duggan and the Rat Pack. Going all the way back to 82 and the early part of 83, when Duggan was still a heel. Now remember, it took a lot of time for him and JYD to finally see eye to eye together. Even when Duggan finally turned babyface, and He was getting beaten up by a lot of members of the Rat Pack, including DiBiase. JYD was not there to help him. It took months for them to finally come to each other's aid. It's kind of a remarkable piece of story detail that today would easily get glossed over. God, the writers don't even think twice about that shit anymore. Context? What's that? The idea that even though two guys might play for the same team, there's still bad blood that dates back to when they were adversaries. They didn't let that go. Took a while because they had to build up trust. And it eventually happened over a period of 4 to 6 months. But to think, that was a story payoff at the end of DiBiase's run in '83. That the Junkyard Dog would be the ultimate difference maker in helping Duggan rid DiBiase in Mid-South. Doesn't get much better than that. So then we had Crusher Darso against the Junkyard Dog. No longer going by Barry Darso. He's still wearing the god-ugly Daisy Dukes, though. But at least they're finally giving him a nickname. Crusher. Quite menacing. Spelled with a K. So you know he's serious. Definitely Darso's biggest competition in Mid-South to date. Of course, everyone and their mother knew Darso wasn't winning this match. So they definitely played up the significance of the defeat. I mean, there's really not a whole lot to say about the match itself. Unless you're a proponent of 5-minute bear hug sequences. It's pretty much all it was. Up until the end when Darso went for the elevated backbreaker, but then JYD used his feet to kick off the ropes and essentially give Darso a backdrop. And then he hit a shoulder tackle and the thump for the pin. Oh, God, I cringed when Dog came down out of that backbreaker hold. He landed right on his kneecaps. I saw that. I was like, how did that guy not shatter an ACL? Like, a guy that size, he should have been limping afterwards. But no, he was fine. Perfectly fine. Definitely had to work for that win, but indeed, Crusher Darso's first loss in Mid-South. Thinking he might need to step up his game a little bit now that he's faced some real competition in the area. He ain't wrestling those ham and eggers anymore, brother. He's in the big leagues. So then we had Butch Reed going over George Weingroff. Very forgettable squash. Oh, and by the way, for those that forgot, Reed is still the North American champion. I'm not going to fault you for forgetting that, because I did too. I mean, the North American title has been on the back burner for well over a month. Complete afterthought on this program. I'm not joking. I saw Reed standing there with the belt around his waist. I was like, oh yeah. He's technically the top star in the territory at the moment. At least they would have it seem that way. All those weeks Reed came out on television and demanded respect from the people, saying he was going to show the people why he deserved to be the champion. Now, then he won it, and we immediately forgot about it because he disappeared for weeks. So he went with the flying shoulder tackle. Again, really nothing much to say about it from there. Nor was there much to say about the next standby. Although it was another face showing up to the area, so we shouldn't undercut it entirely. It's Jim the Anvil Neidhart taking on Art Cruz. Now, of course, for anybody that didn't know the significance of the nickname Anvil, JR pointed it out here. The fact that he held the record for the longest anvil toss back in his home state of Canada. I forget what the number was. I think it was like 12 feet. So that forever cemented him in wrestling as the Anvil. By the way, for anybody wondering how difficult it is to throw an anvil 11 to 12 feet, pretty goddamn difficult, from what I hear. As a percussionist, I've had to move anvils for concerts a handful of times. Not a fun task. Now, this is maybe a year or so removed from Neidhart's run in Stampede Wrestling. For like 1980 to 1985, right before signing with WWF, this guy was all over the place. Canada, Germany, Japan, US. Now, he wrestled everywhere. And when he came down to Midsouth in 83, I think he was also doing work over in like Georgia or Florida at the time. I know he didn't have an extensive run in Mid-South. I know he and Hacksaw Reed ended up becoming the Mid-South Tag Champions within the year. And then I remember they break up and feud afterwards. But yeah, when I looked at the timeline, he's really only around for maybe 6 to 7 months. Because by 84, he's back in Florida for a run. Then he goes to the WWF. It's a very young Jim Neidhart, too. So if you're accustomed to seeing all those photos of him with the long goatee, you'll be sad to know that was not the case in Mid-South. He looked pretty plain. I mean, it's a fine, effective little squash. Another example of a bigger guy using power moves to pretty much control the whole thing. He went over with a delayed Samoan drop. I believe he had something like a 560-pound bench press record. I mean, so he's right up there with guys like Hacksaw Reed and JYD in terms of overall upper body strength. It's kind of scary when you look at a guy like Neidhart, too, and he never really had much of a body. But goddamn, that guy was strong. And it showed here. So, well, they also had another arbitrary, superfluous standby with Tom Stanton and Jerry Caldwell. Really didn't pay attention to that. That was the obligatory piss break segment of the show. It just so happened to come at the end of the program. But yeah, this week was really about bringing in some new faces and putting a bit of closure to the Rat Pack business that carried out through a lot of 83. And now we're seeing them align a couple big programs to carry into the latter half of the year, even early 84. It was a match-heavy show, but they sprinkled in highlights to cover the material from last week. As always, JR, excellent at setting everything up beforehand. His expertise. I mean, it really is an example of another epidemic that spills into modern wrestling these days. God-awful commentators. And across the board, that's not just exclusive to AEW. I mean, I've been very outspoken about my hatred for WWE's commentary. They're just less annoying than Sockface a lot of the time. But Jim Ross is a special kind of voice, man. I mean, I know he's seen better days with a lot of that AEW commentary over the years. It really hasn't been all that remarkable. But old school Jim Ross, I mean, we really need more commentators like him in 2024. Like well-spoken, serious button-down talkers that still have personality, still have passion. The ones that know how to tell stories and make you care. And not basement-dwelling marks that sound like constipated moose So on that happy note, let's move over to World Class Championship Wrestling and pretend I didn't just say that out loud. Offhand, I don't remember a single thing that happened on last week's show. When I clicked the play button to start watching this week, I was like, did we even review World Class last week? If we did, I don't remember a fucking thing that happened. I mean, most of the show's been a blur since the Mike Von Erich health scare incident, which we are still receiving health updates on. I seem to recall last week they replayed a bunch of Labor Day Star Wars footage. Then Kevin tried to get Chris Adams and Gina Hernandez to sign off on a hair versus hair match. Or something to that effect. Also, the stuff going on with Gary Hart and Iceman King Parsons. Another recurring story on TV at the moment. We'll try to get more detailed with the analysis and all that in just a sec here. First, we have to talk about this barn burner of an opener. John Tatum versus Mike Bond. Which was exactly what you would expect a John Tatum versus Mike Bond match to be. It was very plain, very boring. Everything I've ever said about John Tatum's Ric Flair mannerisms continue to ring true. He's not Ric Flair. Discernibly. Although I at least now know the date of the Cotton Bowl event. October 6th. Mark that date on your calendar because you know I'm going to forget it. The only thing about this I can comment on was the hilarity of Bond's comeback. He was throwing punches and kicks at Tatum in such a way where the only thing I thought was, there's no way this guy's ever thrown a real punch in his life. It looked like a 9-year-old trying to whack a punching bag. And meanwhile, Tatum's just trying to cover up his face to make sure he doesn't get plastered with a stiff hook. I don't blame him. That was all I cared to note about it, though. Tatum blocked a splash attempt from Bond with his knees. Then he picked up Bond and gave him a modified gore buster for the 3 count. I did also catch Tatum audibly yelling, "I outsmarted him," right after he blocked the splash. Because, you know, his heel plan succeeded. But that was it for that segment. John Tatum is still not over with me. And I don't think anything has changed since the last 8 or 9 matches I've watched of his. Probably won't change anytime soon either. And then we had a clip from... I think we reviewed this match, didn't we? 6-man tag at Fort Worth with Gary Hart's heel stable against Kevin Carey and Brian Adias. Could have sworn that was something we talked about. Well, if we didn't recap it, they showed the film here. You know what, actually looking back, Jack Victory was also teaming up with Gang and Mark Lewin here, so I don't believe we reviewed this match. Because Killer Tim Brooks wasn't involved. So this is probably taped for the Labor Day special. So who the hell did Brooks wrestle on that show? Might have to look that up later. Doesn't matter. Well, catching the match from the midway portion, it was relatively okay from what I saw. They were kind of working the double heat sequence on Carey and Adias, respectively. The heels were constantly trying to cut off the babyface attempts at making hot tags. Which is funny because the last time Mark Lewin tried to stop a babyface from tagging in, he was disqualified for illegally getting in the ring. Meanwhile, here, he's doing the exact same thing. And all we get is the classic Bronco Lubitsch hand wave. Like, no, no, no. Don't you dare interfere, sir. even though I'm not going to do a goddamn thing about it. Never actually called for a DQ. I don't know. It was what it was. Ending was great, though, because Kerry finally makes his own comeback on the heels, manages to tag in Kevin. I don't believe Kevin tagged in one time during the whole exchange here. So he comes off the top rope, gives Lewin a sunset pin roll-up, just pins him clean. I was like, what a comeback for Kevin. Must have pulled double duty on this card, because that was an easy workout for him. Just stand on the apron, hit one move off the top rope, and there you go. Match is over. Contextually, I have no idea where this fit on the Labor Day card. I don't know, kind of looked like something they would have plugged in the semi-main or even main event spot, depending on what the Von Erichs were doing. It was still weird not seeing Brooks involved here, but I mean, again, I have to assume he was either working another match on the card or maybe he was hurt. So they just looked around and said, what heel can we plug into this spot that's not currently booked? How about Jack Victory? He's not doing anything constructive, is he? So there you have it. They did say, or I should say Mark Lawrence said, he brought up the double hair match between Kevin and Kerry versus Gino and Chris. So I guess it is a tag match with both sets of teams' hair on the line. So whichever team loses, I imagine both of them get their head shaved. Yeah, I'm totally out to lunch there. No idea who could possibly lose that belt. The Von Erichs may be in grave danger. God, can you imagine if they actually went through with shaving Kevin and Kerry's hair? You want to talk about the hottest heat angle since the Freebird slammed the cage door on Kerry back in 1982? Dude. They'd have lit the wrestling world on fire here. No joke. Probably could have turned it all around. And world class would have been saved. Nah, I'm just kidding. So then we had Jim Powell versus Brian Adias back at the Sportatorium. And Adias is now 1/3 a representative of the six-man tag team champions alongside Kevin and Kerry. So he dropped the Texas Heavyweight title as of like a week or two ago. Now they just swap it and give him a six-man belt. Well, at least it's not a tag belt. It is now the third tier or bronze level singles championship. What an accomplishment. So here's everything I wrote down. Literally, this is going to be a 5-second recap, and then we're going to move on. Adias held Powell down in a chin lock for 20 minutes. Almost dropped him on an overhead press slam. Then he gave him the running warrior splash off the ropes for the 3. And then we came to a segment. This fucking segment. So remember last week, we saw the debut of the Tahiti legend Rangi, and we led off the conversation by simply asking, who in the blue fuck was Rangi? Well, the answer was apparently a nobody, that they then tried to make into a somebody and epically failed. That was Rangi's run in a nutshell without getting too in depth. So, well, we also noted, according to my research, I found out that Rangi wrestled Mark Lewin at one point. I was doing some digging on Google, and sure enough, that video popped up. We did not have to wait long to see it, though. Apparently that match happened the following week. Someone actually uploaded that to YouTube. Probably not even as a joke. Probably figured, well, someone will want to see this match. Well, I saw it. It was not quite the horror show I was expecting. Although that's a very low bar. It was still wacky and not very good. I would first like to point out here, Bill Mercer, in his attempts to comment on the state of Mark Lewin, he explains that he's essentially on the spectrum by indicating that he's someone that is long gone from his personal self. Those were almost his exact words. I'm not kidding you. Because you cannot say, this man should be locked up in a loony bin and left for evaluation. No, that would be politically incorrect. So he claimed that he's long gone from his own well-being. Now, I would like to point out, I don't really know what that means in the first place, given no context. But now that we know Mark Lewin's entire gimmick is that he's crazy and unhinged, and he makes wacky noises, well, it makes perfect sense. Which makes it that much funnier. So the entire match is Rangi essentially running from Lewin and not having any clue how to wrestle him. Probably because he legitimately had no fucking clue how to wrestle him. He spent almost the entire match getting beaten up and selling for whatever you would classify as Lewin's offense. And then things got kind of messy with Rangi attempting to make his own comeback on Lewin. But then Lewin just kept no-selling everything. So Mark just slapped on a sleeper hold and got him to pass out. And then, I'm trying to think of a way to explain this without being crude. Mark Lewin then crawled over Rangi's dead body and then rubbed his balls on Rangi's face. That was me trying to be uncrude. There's really no other way to justify it. He rubbed his junk up against Rangi's face. And then he made wacky bird gestures with his arms. So this guy was in Kevin Sullivan's heel stable in Florida, huh? He definitely fit the group. If you would have told me with a straight face, Mark Lewin is the kind of guy that would hang out with devil worshippers and storyline, I would totally believe you. Would not doubt it for a second. And again, I should remind you, this match was not as bad as I thought it would be. I don't know what the hell my expectations were. Somehow they superseded my low expectations. And then for the main event on this week's program, the American Tag titles on the line here. It's Gino and Chris defending against Kevin and Kerry. This is, I believe, the third or fourth title defense that Gino and Chris have had against the Von Erich brothers. Bear that in mind for the finish, by the way. So they allotted plenty of time to this here. Ended up being a hell of a little fight by the end. I mean, I know it's cliche anytime we discuss a Von Erich versus Chris Gino match, singles or tag. The matches are always going to be outstanding. It is kind of weird to see them doing this match on free television when they literally just announced the same match with these guys for the Cotton Bowl event in October. Obviously throwing in the hair stipulation. With that said, they all worked hard. They had time to let things breathe and, let the heels get a chance to work over Kevin and Kerry here. Built up to some big four-way spots later on. The climax if you want to call it that. It was a deal where Kerry and Chris bonk heads, and while they both go down, they melt the hot tag for Kevin, and they're setting up the tease that Kevin's about to score the fall over Gino, but then Chris comes in and whacks him over the back of the head with a title belt. Automatic disqualification. And when I tell you that he whacked Kevin over the back of the head with this thing, I'm talking hard, brother. Like hard as shit. Like Chris went in there and hit Kevin with his belt like he owed him trans. Holy fuck, that was brutal. And like the funny part, during the scuffle, Gino was the one that walked out of it with a bloody nose. I don't know what happened there. He must have gotten stiff by either Kevin or Kerry at one point. Kind of looked like his nose was broken. So I don't know what the hell was going on there. I just remember looking up and Gino's gushing blood. And it's getting everywhere. Like you see Chris looking at him momentarily like, oh fuck, that doesn't look good. He looked in rough shape. But the bigger news here, Mark Lawrence is about to announce that the heels retain the belts on account of the titles not being able to change hands on a DQ. Not in David Manning's world, brother. He steps up and said, absolutely not. Oh, hell no. So he gets on the house mic. He says this is the third time Gino and Chris have deliberately tried to DQ themselves to get out of a title shot, or a title defense. So he is now holding up the belts. He is making sure the next time we see this match take place, there will be a fair winner, and that the heels can't weasel their way out of retaining the belts on account of a DQ or intentional countout. Yeah, I had to figure David Manning was going to be the difference maker. But it also adds an extra wrinkle to the double hair stipulation, because if that match also ends up being for the belts too, well, that's a double whammy. Telling you, this Cotton Bowl event is shaping up to be a hell of a show. And I do remember the 84 event being pretty enjoyable last year. Those stadium events are always huge, especially when they fill the seats. Obviously, they're not going to get to max capacity, but man, a lot of people in attendance, and especially with those hot crowds. Good Lord. It was like a WrestleMania environment back then. And you know that hair match is going to be dynamite. Those people are going to go knucking futs when the Von Erichs go over. I think the real question is, are they going to deliver on that hair stipulation? Or is it going to be a false advertisement like that TakeOver special we reviewed the other week? And we'll see. But that's going to round out this one here. I'm going to get into the editing early because got to be out of here by like 10 o'clock tomorrow. So hitting the road. The big moving day. So thanks everybody for watching. We'll stay in touch and I'll catch you guys soon. Take care. Peace out.